Welcome to A Drop of Silence, the groundbreaking podcast series that dives deep into the realms of controversy. Join us as we bring special guests who share their extraordinary experiences and offer unparalleled insight into history, today's news headlines, and the future. Get ready to embark on a thought-provoking journey where silence speaks volumes and the truth lies somewhere beneath the surface.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor?
I've asked Marcia Seigerman to come on the podcast series because we have interviewed Holocaust survivors. And because I've taken care of so many survivors, and I've talked about them in my book, Still the Soul Survives, one of the things that has become that people have recognized over the years is the PTSD that not only the Holocaust survivor has gone through, but what their children have had to go through, because a lot of survivors do not know how to cope, and they did not know how to cope. And they didn't seek help for that because for whatever reasons, I think a lot of it is they didn't think they were worthy. But a lot of Holocaust survivors, especially the women who were attacked and raped, they raised their daughters to be a certain way. Hoarding is a classic thing that Holocaust survivors do. There's all of these symptoms that you look at and you go, oh, there's PTSD. And then the Holocaust survivors' children, oh, here's another form of PTSD, and it comes from the child, but having to live with Holocaust survivors. And Marcia Seigerman is one of those survivors. And you'll find it very interesting in the way that she talks. And she's very kind. She's very compassionate. She adores her father. But she had some problems. She couldn't face what had happened to him. And I'll let you hear it in her words. Welcome, everybody, to A Drop of Silence podcast series. I'm Pam Goldstein, your host. And with me today is Marcia Seigerman. Marcia's father was a Holocaust survivor. And so Marcia has the title of being the second generation survivors of the Holocaust. And I'm so glad that she's here. So welcome, Marcia. Welcome to this podcast. I hope everything's okay with you today. And we're going to start with, who was the Holocaust survivor in your family? Was it both your parents or your mother or father, or who was it?
Hi, Pam. First of all, thank you for having me on my debut. I'm honored.
Yeah.
My father was the Holocaust survivor in my family. He married an American woman. So my father is the one who went through all of the trauma that he shared with us.
So let's start with your dad's history. Where was he born, and what exactly happened to him during the war?
Okay, so my father was born in 1921 in Malawa, Poland, which is about 100 miles west of Germany. He grew up in a very closely knit family. Everyone knew everyone by their first names. He was the second oldest of 4 brothers, and they were all very, very close. My dad grew up in a fairly wealthy household. They got new shoes for the holidays, all of them. They went to day schools, which was a paid education. And his father was able to loan out money to neighbors and people who knew him, and he never charged interest. So I think that was an indication of his nature and also his financial status in the community. So he was very, very generous. He lived next door to his grandparents, so he really spent a great deal of time with both of his grandparents next door. This was on my father's side, his mom and his dad. And I just might say that I started learning about my father's past, not as a child, but more so as a teen and a young adult when he was first approached by a high school administrator in our community, a little ways from our community, and asked him to please speak to his students. And as I helped my dad draft or edit, I was like, wow, it was an eye-opener to me, and I sort of wondered and pondered, why did I never take the initiative to ask some of these questions? And to this day, I cannot pinpoint a reason why I didn't. Some of it thinks that I just perhaps didn't want to bring pain to him, or I just couldn't handle the level of torture and the atrocities that he went through in his family and the loss. So it was easier for me to just not see it than to face it.
When the Germans took over Poland in 1939, where was your father located at that time?
In 1939, he was still in his hometown in Malava, Poland.
And during those next few years, did Malava become like a ghetto, like Warsaw? Did that also become a ghetto?
They moved the people out of Malava and took them to a nearby grounds, not the Warsaw area,
Okay,
a different
but another
ghetto.
one. Okay, so when he arrived in Auschwitz, was that 1942 then?
Yes, he arrived on November 17th. That's the day of deportation, 1942. And I always will remember November 17th because that's also the date of his death in 2020.
Okay, so that would mean that your father was there for at least 2 years, probably 3 then, correct? Before
Correct.
emancipation?
The last from January of 45 to May 6th, 45, he was in an auxiliary camp of Mauthausen in Ebensee, Austria. And that's the place, that's the concentration camp from where he was liberated.
And what was he doing at that camp?
At that camp, the Germans just wanted to move them along. They thought that things were starting to look bad on their end and they wanted to get them out. They destroyed the grounds as best as they could and as much evidence as they could and moved them on to another concentration camp.
So how long was he in the concentration camp then? A year?
No, he was in the concentration camp till, let me see, like about 2.5 years. He left Auschwitz, was taken to another camp in January of 45. And that was a concentration camp in Austria. It was called Ebensee, and it was an auxiliary camp of Mauthausen. And he was there from January to May of 1945. But the bulk of his duration in a concentration camp was in Auschwitz, where he talks. I want to preface this by saying some of my information, and a good chunk of it, I credit to a cousin of mine who wrote a beautiful bound book. He had 4 grandparents and some other relatives, including my father, who were survivors. And in the mid-20s, at his young age, he produced this magnificent book, spent hours interviewing all of our family members and his family members. So I learned a lot through that book, which helped me understand that.
And
you know, like,
did he describe what he had to do in Auschwitz and Ebernhauser?
yeah,
Ebernhausen?
before that, I just want to point out when he was in the ghetto that they felt and saw low-flying German airplanes that they tried to escape and just leave that area, and they ended up as a family gathering what they could to try to run away, not even knowing where the destination was. And they hid in, and I read this in the book, they hid in a potato field while the planes were flying over, and it was there overnight. And when they realized that it was quiet, then they realized it was safe to go home.
Mhm.
But shortly thereafter, there was the ghetto where everybody was hurtled into an area where they had to wear a yellow star identifying that they were Jewish and had many limitations. They were able at that time to go in and out with, you know, some restrictions, but they could go in and out. And a resourceful father of my father's had the shoemaker in the ghetto add a false heel to all of their shoes. And with that false heel, he put a little hole, and they were able to hide money in there, which was helpful because then they were able to sell it on the black market for different kinds of goods and foods. Never thinking they would have to use it, but just in case, and they did have to use it.
Mm-hmm.
When my dad was first taken to Auschwitz, he didn't know what a selection was. He just knew that there were those lines that we often hear about, men on one side and children and women on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard him firsthand telling the story to a doctor that he went to. I took him to a pain specialist, and he was visibly crying, as was I, when he said, I should have grabbed my brother. I should have grabbed my brother, because he and his brother, who he went with, and his father, the three of them were in one line, and the other, and was his youngest brother, who was about 12 at that time, 12 or 13. And they never saw them again. My father also, he when he got there, he noticed that the people who were, when he was getting the tattoo of the number on his arm, he noticed that those doing the tattoos seemed to be a little better fed or had a little more color in their face. So he thought, maybe I could do that. So he said, I can do that. I can do that. So they gave him the instrument, and his first person, they screamed at my dad because he didn't press hard enough. He didn't press deep enough. He didn't imprint the number, you know, and they slapped him and moved him, and that was not what his job was going to be. So he failed at having a heart because he had a heart and couldn't do that. He was trained to be a bricklayer, which was just all day, any weather, barely wearing any, you know, clothes that weren't tattered, shoes that were, you know, bare, that you could feel every cobblestone that they were walking through. He did some work at a laundry too, and thought he was being crafty, and hid a shirt under his uniform, and he was caught. And he really thought, this is the end. They took him to what was considered a barrack of death, and he was waiting, and for some miracle, and the SS guard who was going to be executing him got called away, and he survived. And he doesn't know why he survived, but, you know, he was taken back, he was beaten, he was profoundly abused in his stomach area and kidneys, which ultimately led him to having renal tuberculosis, which I can address later, but that was a diagnosis from the severe treatment that he got while he was there.
Yeah.
His oldest brother, I said there were four, the little one never made it. The oldest brother was in a revisionist, like a Zionist camp, a Zionist movement, and he didn't make it to the deportation because he ran away with the group to try to do some work that they had to do. And only later did they hear that he was killed, and they never knew firsthand. It was hearing it from somebody. Body was never returned, and that was a very hard thing for the whole family to comprehend, those that survived.
So he was in the second camp you mentioned
For a short time.
when liberation happened.
Yeah, by the U.S. Army, he was liberated. So it was from January till May 6th, which they celebrate as Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance.
And
that
did he
was
go to Cyprus then?
No, he went to like a deportation camp. They set him up there, and then there was a place in Italy that he ended up going. Wait, a major part of a piece when they were getting ready to go between Auschwitz and Mauthausen, his brother came to him and said, one of us needs to leave. I'm ready. I'm going to try to leave, escape with a friend of his. And my father gave him a different shirt that he found from somebody who had perished. And so it was more of a civilian looking shirt. They parted with tears in their eyes, not knowing if they would ever see each other. Spoiler alert, they both survived. And my father was on his way to Israel, and they said that they were going to take him first to Italy, and there was going to be a means to get them to Israel. When I don't know how you could relate to this. I don't know how without the internet and without technology, someone word of mouth said, I've seen your brother. I've seen your brother. And so
that actually happened a lot.
Yeah, I guess it did, but it's just crazy
weird
to think. Yeah.
So how did he meet his wife?
How did my father meet his wife? Well, when he came back he found his brother in Italy, in a different part of Italy, and they reunited, and it was joyful and crying, and even to this, well, neither of them are living now, but when they would get together, their foreheads would be inches apart as they engaged in conversation. Honestly, we don't even know what they talked about. We would just sit there while they're off in their own world again. Probably would have helped us if we sat in on that world, but we didn't. So my father ended up going back to, my uncle decided to go to New York. I don't know his rationale. And so he said, you're coming with me, Leo. Lipa was his Yiddish name. You're coming with me. My father said, okay. And he was a much more slow-paced man, very mindful, and it was rough in New York for him. He didn't like staying on the subway for a half hour and rushing. And a cousin came to New York and heard he was there and said, come to Detroit. It's slower pace. It's going to be an easier life for you. And, he was pretty much situated. He had his brother there, but he realized that he wasn't going to have much of a life if he himself couldn't handle that pace and that lifestyle. So he went back with her, found a job through somebody in a dry goods store, and he got it because they were shipping and mailing out different items. And my father had beautiful penmanship and could write in English, because don't ask me, not even quite sure how he learned. He did learn the language. And they said most of the applicants couldn't fill out the application, and they were eliminated. So he started at 75 cents a week. And
so how did he meet her? How did he meet his wife?
So he went to a dance at the local Detroit Jewish Community Center. And my mother was also there looking for her bashert, her person that was meant to be. And they found each other. And my mother came from a very small town, Oil City, Pennsylvania, which is tiny. And she left because she wanted to see a Jewish population so she could meet somebody. and I don't think she expected to meet a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
And they became engaged, and shortly thereafter is when his illnesses and all of the pains surfaced.
Yeah.
Not again, but continued, but really manifested. That he went to the hospital, to the doctors, and they recommended this Jewish hospital in Colorado, in Denver, that was known to help this type of
Right.
tuberculosis. And he was there for
Yes.
over a year and maintained an ongoing, not through email, relationship, through phone calls, and through
That's where his beautiful penmanship came into.
there you go, letters.
So when you were growing up, did your father ever talk about being a Holocaust survivor, or did he try and lead a perfectly normal life?
That's a really good question. I think it was more me who didn't talk about it than my father. Honestly, I didn't feel all that different, and it's probably because I blocked out what was different. I knew that he had a number, engraved on his arm, and I knew that that was what it meant, but we didn't ask a lot of questions. It was really only until that high school administrator came. I grew up, and I kind of chuckle at this because my kids don't even know what Malox is. It was an antacid beverage, not a beverage. We thought it was a beverage, and it was on the counter, and he was drinking it like people now are drinking bottled water.
Yeah.
And that was just to coat his stomach. He had such pain. So I recognized that was a little different. The story about, he would tell us, this he told us, is that they would literally throw scraps of potato peels to the prisoners, almost like they would treat dogs with more respect. And he would say they didn't realize that there actually was some nutrition in the skins, more so than the starchy potato. So I think that's what helped them survive. But to this day, we would see, and we never understood until later, oh, that's the reason. I mean, he would take all the skin off of his potatoes, all the skin off of tomatoes, all the skin off of any cucumber. And it was, he couldn't handle eating skins because that's what he lived on, in the watered down soup. And he always would make soup be extra thick. We're like, you need a fork to eat that soup. And I think his diet was a reflection of the lack of food. Food was a big thing, and growing up, we had metal shelves in our basement that had stashes of canned food and canned fruit and canned vegetables and toilet paper and paper goods. And I don't know, I didn't know the word hoarding then, but I don't know if it was as a way to save things just in case they needed to leave or couldn't go anywhere.
A lot of the patients I took care of were famous for hoarding. Their children would talk about how they would have 20 and 30 packages of toilet paper and paper towels, and they did canning and all those things.
I mean, we joked it looked like a warehouse down there. I mean, we would go, even as young and married, I said, oh, I need this. I could go downstairs. I could take 3-4 things. It didn't make a dent.
Yeah.
So I'm recognizing that those are some of the things. And,
yeah. So how was he when you decided to get married? Was your father excited that you found your Besheret and were going to get married? And
yeah, my dad had a big twinkle in his eye, and he was just beaming. He was really truly beaming. I think, I was the first girl in the family. Like, he was one of the 4 boys, and his brother had 2 boys, and his other brother and the nephew had boys. So it was sort of like I was like a little apple of his eye.
yeah.
And so too with my daughter. My daughter would say, well, contrary to when I first started, and I just didn't say to people, oh, my dad's a survivor or anything like that. I just didn't talk like that. I couldn't stop talking about it when I was older, like, oh, my dad's a survivor. And my daughter would say, Mom, he's a lot more. He's a lot more than a survivor. That's all you think of him as. And I don't know if I'm overcompensating, but I'm just so, amazed in how much I honor him for what he went through and how he survived.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be one of the Holocaust survivors I knew. She never talked about the Holocaust at all until she was in her 50s. And it was
Mm,
her grandson who asked the question
mm.
of, Bubby, what was it like living in Europe in the war? And she said once she started talking about it, she couldn't stop. And she went on and spoke to organizations all over the place and everything. And but you said your father was eager to talk about it. He wanted to talk about it all through.
Right, right. I mean, once, if we were to ask, or my daughter would ask the question, what was Hanukkah like? Well, that started out answering that question, but it branched out to so many, we would forget, wait, what was the initial question? Because he just wanted so much to pour out his story
Story.
and his memories. And, of course, I didn't ask enough questions. I'm
But you,
sad that I don't know a lot about his parents. I know that she baked challah, she made a cholent, which is like long cooking stew.
right.
But I don't know her personality. I don't know what she really looked like. There are no pictures.
Yeah,
Those are little
right.
things that I wish I had a better picture of.
Yeah. So did you ever write down any of the things he said as years went by? Have you written his story down at all?
Well, my dad was interviewed through the Spielberg Foundation.
Oh,
So
excellent.
we do have all of that documentation. And there's a thing at the Seigerman Holocaust Memorial Center that's the portraits of honor, and there's some stories, not stories, they're narrative, a brief narrative, and that's archived in there. The book that my cousin wrote is a documentation. And I think the exercise of being in this cohort to be a second generation presenter has forced me to take a deeper look at things. I had this book, I didn't read it for 10 years. I skimmed it, but it really wasn't until last year, that I actually started reading some of the stuff in it.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm sure you must have felt that to have a parent that went through such a horrible thing. I think it would be very difficult to hear that story about your parent.
Right. And it was easier to see my dad as the current person and not dive into his past and to hear how painful it is. And of course I would read Holocaust books, and everybody, read Anne Frank and different, varieties of novels and memoirs. And, that was it. It's interesting. I find that you treated a lot of patients. Like looking back, my dad had a first geriatric psychiatric appointment when he was probably 94 years old.
Wow.
And that was mostly just, I don't know, because we were at our wits' end and there were so many things, and he could prescribe medicine for anxiety. And I think that was really the reason, not so much as a counselor or as a therapist, but more as a medical avenue.
So what did you do on that trip when you went back to Poland in 98?
We went back to see where my father's hometown was. His house was no longer standing, but we saw the property. We saw where his grandparents, in proximity to his house, was. There was a pond that he said he would go fishing that was still there. And then we went to Auschwitz and actually saw the different sites, and he was firsthand telling us about, this barrack is where I stood. This is what it looked like when I had to sleep.
Was he tearful? Like, did it really move him? Or was he still as strong as he always was?
He really was quite strong. I think the message leaving, and how I felt at least, was we walked into Auschwitz, and as a family, so many more 3 generations were there. My father, I was there, and my kids were there. We were able to walk out, unlike the generations that he, when he was there.
Mhm.
The younger
And-
generation didn't make it, and the older generation, majorities of those populations didn't make it. So yes, there were tears, but there was also a resilience that I saw when we left.
Did it make you feel stronger as a Jew to do that?
Prouder, maybe, I would say. I think I had pretty strong convictions. I do still. So I don't know that that empowered me more to be more Jewish or anything like that, but it certainly made, an impact to see firsthand what my dad experienced. Not really
So-
what he experienced, but to see.
Yeah. So now with all the rise of anti-Semitism and everything,
Ugh.
was your dad's experience, does that give you any inner strength, like a stronger strength? Knowing that the worst, the absolute worst happened and he survived, does it give you hope that, we're going to be strong enough to stand up to the evil people this time and survive?
Yes, I am hopeful, but I've grown up with the never again, never again, never again. And it's like, what? It isn't never again. It is now.
Yeah, it's
So
always.
it's a little bit, not a little, it's very concerning that we are still dealing with this, and it's obviously surfaced so much more. I do think we're going to overcome it. I don't know how. I do get scared when I see and hear and read different things.
So, your children, they had a really close relationship with your dad,
Very much so.
and they're quite comfortable with his story, are they not?
Yeah, they are comfortable, but like it's very interesting because my daughter, my dad was fluent in Hebrew, and as is both of my kids, but my daughter's especially would go to a Hebrew class with him, and like she said, I don't see Zadie as just a Holocaust survivor. He was a student. He was a learner. The teacher would joke and say if they didn't have the answer, they would ask my dad, to tell us the answer or something like that. She says
Yeah.
like I only have a limited scope. In fact, when I was telling her today I was doing this, she said, well, that's good exercise for you, Mom, because all you do is talk about, how much you miss him and love him and that he's a survivor. So it's maybe good to have a different, you'll be able to tell a little bit more than just your feelings about that. So.
Yeah. So say again, I wrote it down and now I can't find it in my myriad of pages. What did your father do for a living once he got here?
Once he got here and got settled and was married, he worked for a drapery company. And my father was very meticulous. He had some training, at one point he thought maybe he would be a dental technician, and he was so into precision, but he never had the opportunity to follow through with that once he got here with his illness and getting married and life. But he was so meticulous with his drapes. Each pleat had to be perfect. We joked if he was a dentist, he'd take, 2 hours for one cleaning. It's like he'll never make a business doing that. So he did that, and he worked for somebody else, and then he branched out on his own and had his little business out of his basement. And
wow.
So it was like a little mom and pop. My mom did some stuff, and even I think my brother and I, we even put little drapery pins in, there. And he had one or two seamstresses, but other than that, he would do everything and measure, hang, wash, do all that stuff himself, which was his enjoyment.
So now that you're older and you now know all of his story and everything, how did you become involved with the Seigerman Foundation, and you're going to become a docent there at the
But not quite a docent. I'm not going through the exhibit. Once the guide has taken them through the docent, then they will come into the auditorium and have a conversation with me, and I'll do a presentation. So it's used to be that a survivor would do that, and there may be a a 1 or 2 or 3 that are capable and able, physically and emotionally and mentally able to.
Yeah.
So that's more my role as opposed to going through it with the tour. So students that come through and different organizations that come through. I got involved. I've done a few little activities that through Chaim, the children's Holocaust second generation. Not that much. Surprisingly, I don't know who referred me, honestly, because I got a letter in the mail and an email saying, as a second generation, would you be interested in joining this cohort? And my first reaction was thanks, but no.
Yeah.
I don't want to go there. I've come to terms with everything, and I decided to try it. And there was like a cohort last summer. It was probably over a 6 months meeting 4 to 7 times, and it was interesting to hear different people's stories, and it was interesting to do that. And some people have finished their writing, some people haven't, some people have presented, some people haven't. So it's kind of a process that I'm going through, but that's where I am.
Yeah, it's interesting how you're now the person telling your father's story, and dealing with the Holocaust in a museum.
I mean, I did teach at a Jewish day school, and when they would have Yom HaShoah, and I taught little kids, the 2nd and 3rd graders, so it was not
easy.
But I was asked a couple times if I could just briefly talk about my father to 6th and 7th graders. So I had a little bit of talking about it, but again, that was on a level of, keeping it simple and yet impactful at the same time.
Yeah.
So, I think my background at a Jewish day school, somebody knew that I did that as well. So
yeah, I think you're going to be great at it. I do.
Okay.
Think you will.
Well, I appreciate your support. I'll call you whenever I do it.
Yeah, no, I think you'll be great at it. And and it's interesting. I think the more insight that you've learned about your dad, I think that's helped. I don't know, you can tell me I'm wrong. Has it helped you to accept the Holocaust? Because a lot of Jewish people still have not accepted that the Holocaust happened. They're just so overwhelmed by it. They don't want to hear anything about it. But
no, I never I don't think I fit into that category. I've always had a strong emotional, ties to that. Like,
yeah,
I saw firsthand, I saw bruises, I saw my dad's number. There was never any question, about that. And my dad was open about it. His brother and sister-in-law wore Band-Aids to cover their number because they didn't want to be asked. They didn't want to share. They wanted to blend in New York, it was a busy place, and they were able to keep that silent. Ultimately, they started talking a little bit. My cousin who wrote the book got his grandparents to answer some questions. But I remember my aunt said some people thought it was her phone number. Oh, you had to put your phone number? Like that. I think that was like so painful to hear.
Yeah. So, I thank you so much for talking about it. I've talked to a lot of second generation, and they fall in these categories: total denial. They don't want to hear about it. Or as they got older, then they wanted to hear about it and started talking about it. Or that they were so overwhelmed by it that they became almost like Holocaust survivors themselves, that they were terrified to be out in society. They just wanted to be by themselves. But I think you're great. I think you're going to do wonderful.
Well, golly gee, thanks for your endorsement. I appreciate that, Pam.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll come on again and talk about your experiences at the museum once you get going.
Okay, I look forward to that.
And thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for this opportunity.
once more.
This podcast is brought to you by Unbreakable Bindings Publishing Company. Executive produced by Lori Baldassi, produced by Ryan Richardson, hosted by Pam Goldstein.